Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for tuning in today. We're going to just take a moment to connect with our compassionate intention for attending this class today. Just take a moment. Let's see. We are here today so that we can learn how to be more present and compassionate for the benefit of all beings. So let's just center in that intention. And we'll start with some opening prayers. There's a link to the opening prayers in the description of this video. We'll say these in Tibetan, but feel free to read along in English if you'd like. We'll chant the first prayer 3 times, and then the next prayers are 1 time each. Organ yogi nom jansam pemage sa dompola yatsen chogi ngorupne pemajong ne jesura koru kandro mangpokor ketki jesu da druki jinji lop chia sheksu so guru pema city home. Organ yogi num jansam pemage sa dompola yatsen chogi ngorupne pemajong ne jesu koru kandro mangpokor ketki jesu dak druki jinji lop chia sheksu so guru pema city home. Organ yogi num jansam pemage sa dompola yatsen chogi ngorupne pemajong ne jesu drak koru kandro mangpokor ketki jesu dak druki jinji lop chia sheksu so guru pema city home. Continuing on. Ogmen choki inki podana dusum sange kongki ngawonyet rangsem choku ngonson tonzepe tawe lama namla sowadem. Kunzan dosem garab chiri sing pema kara jipani shunga sozo nimna teten gata so kata lama namla sowadem. My pages are a little out of order, so if that was out of order for you, I apologize. We're now on the short mandala offering on page 5. Sashi pochu chuching me to cham re rab ling shini de gempadi sange zing du mek te po wahi droko nam da jing la cho pa shok tram guru ratna mandala putsa mega samudra saparana samaya hom. And the request for teaching. Sentient namki sampadang lohi je jajita je chon to monte pahi choki korlo kordu so. All right. We're going to start with a brief meditation to stabilize our minds. Meditation is the natural state of mind when it is relaxed, stable, and open. Meditating in this way trains our mind to be calm and relaxed, yet also alert and wakeful. And the point of meditation is to create space in our minds. Creating space in the mind helps us to balance our emotions, allowing time between action and reaction. And this is actually the first step in development of bodhicitta, which is the compassionate wish to free all sentient beings from suffering. So first, we need to create some space in our mind for that compassion to arise. So take a comfortable seat, either in a chair or cross-legged on the floor, and place your hands in your lap, gently relaxed. You can either have your hands just resting on your knees, or you can place your right hand in your left hand with the thumbs touching and place those right below your navel. And check in with your posture. Make sure that your spine is straight, your shoulders are open, your elbows are out a bit so that your rib cage is open. And your eyes will remain open, gently looking down. You can imagine a line following the bridge of your nose and extending down to the floor. And just find a point along this line where it's comfortable to rest your gaze. And then place the tip of your tongue gently behind your front teeth. Allow yourself to relax completely and breathe normally. And then put a very light attention on your breath. Don't try to control it at all. Just breathe naturally with the most gossamer thin attention on your breath. It's like taking your pulse. You don't put any pressure on it, just observe it. Your attention is like a feather, gently riding on the surface of your breath. And when the thoughts come up, which they will, just let them go like bubbles popping on the surface of a pond. Let them pop. Don't even look to see what they are. Your meditation is not by hearing your thoughts, but by following those thoughts down the road. So when you find yourself following a thought, just drop it. Just let the thought pop and return to your breath. If it's really difficult for you to dismiss your thoughts, you can imagine tongs picking up the thought and dropping it, or you can visualize cutting the thoughts with scissors and throwing them away. But you always return to your single-pointed concentration. Return again and again to the gossamer thin attention on the surface of your breath. And we'll meditate like this for 5 minutes. So that is a meditation that it's a meditation that you can do pretty much anytime. Anytime you just have a few minutes to sit down and focus on your breath. It's a really excellent meditation to calm and center the mind. You can do it every day. That's the best, even if it's only for a few minutes. We just did it for 5 minutes, which is a pretty good amount of time for a beginner, but that might even be a lot for some people. And so even if you only start with 1 minute or 2 minutes, start wherever you are. And over time, you'll build up some ability to do this for longer and longer periods of time. So today I want to talk about compassion. And the reason that this came to mind for me as a topic to talk about today, other than the fact that it's the most important topic that there is burnout. I think a lot of us right now are experiencing burnout. And at the very least, like at one point or another, we all experience burnout at some point in our lives. You might be working too many hours or not getting enough rest, or maybe you lost sight of your why, of why you're doing the things you're doing. Why do you have this job? Why did you decide to sign up to do this volunteer activity or that volunteer activity? We experience burnout at points in our life. And when this happens, we become kind of desiccated inside, just empty shells trying to keep up with our to-do lists, but there's no juice there. There's no heart. There's no ardor. And this can also happen to us on the spiritual path, right? And we've just discovered our path or our teacher, and we're in the honeymoon phase with stars in our eyes. We don't think this will ever happen to us. We think that our enthusiasm for practice will be ever present. And then it's not. And then we reach some point when it's just not there. We just don't have that enthusiasm anymore. And we're tired and dry inside, just that desiccated feeling. Now, sometimes people start out on the path of Dharma and they're really fired up. They practice for many years. They go on retreat. They're really into it. And then at some point, this karmic flip switches and they lose interest. They get bored with it, or it becomes too difficult. They just don't want to do it anymore. And they drift back into this very ordinary kind of life. This doesn't have to happen to you, but it could. We should prepare for that, because if it's not happening to you now, if it hasn't happened to you in the past, it definitely could happen to any one of us. Jetsama says the antidote for that event is to cultivate compassion in your mind every day. If you move along the path of Buddha Dharma and become overworked by it, thinking, I just can't practice that many hours a day. I cannot do this activity that propagates the Dharma anymore. It's just too much. If you become dry inside, if you think you just can't go on, there's only one way that could happen to you. You have forgotten the suffering of others. And that happens so easily to us. Our habit is not to think of others. Our habit is to think of ourselves. And we think that thinking of ourselves will bring us happiness. But if it did, we would all be totally happy right now, because all we do is think of ourselves, right? So if, let's simple math, if thinking of ourselves brought us happiness and all we do is think of ourselves, why aren't we happy now? Because it doesn't work. It doesn't bring us happiness. What it does is it dries us up inside until all we can think of is, what's in it for me? And that is not, that thought, what's in it for me? How can I be happy? How can I be more comfortable in this moment? There's no heart in that. There's no love in that. There's no fuel there to keep you going. the fuel that we really need to keep us going in our ordinary lives, but especially on the spiritual path. The fuel we need is compassion. That's what fuels us. That's what keeps us moving forward, is compassion. But we have to work at it because it's not our habit. Jagda Tuku says, compassion is not a theory. It is a feeling, an experience. It is not something we acquire, nor is it created by some biochemical process. Compassion arises in the immediacy of the moment, when we see suffering directly and realize the plight of beings, who almost invariably respond to suffering in ways that will only intensify their tragic condition. Compassion is a natural quality. It's an aspect of our true nature that lies dormant within each of us. It must be awakened. We may think we're compassionate. We may think we're kind. Sure, we may be nice to our neighbors. We might bake brownies for the meetings, and we cry at the Sarah McLachlan ASPCA video, but we haven't even begun to explore the depth of our compassion that lies within us. We are splashing around in a puddle when we could be setting out to sea. But awakening our compassion is painful because we must contemplate deeply the suffering of countless beings. Not understanding their predicament, we feel so little compassion for them now. But once we truly comprehend it, once we truly comprehend the depth of their predicament, which is really the karma of cause and effect that keeps people locked into a cycle of suffering. Once we truly comprehend that, compassion wells up within us, a flood so powerful that nothing and no one could stop it from overflowing. Right now, our compassion is not like that. Right now, our compassion is biased and limited. We feel that some are worthy of it and some aren't. The compassion we have for our family and friends is based mostly on our attachment to them. We don't extend that same care toward all beings, especially not towards those who anger or repulse us. But no matter how misguided or how annoying they may be, every single being deserves our compassion. We must learn to extend our compassion beyond the limits of our attachment, beyond the limits of our ordinary judgment, until it encompasses all beings for all time. An easy way to start is to watch the evening news. It's a very simple way to start. And now we have a 24-hour news cycle, so you don't even have to wait till evening. You can start any time of day. But the news is full of horrifying examples of pain, suffering, loss, and death. There's plane crashes, fires, floods, earthquakes, tornadoes, pandemics, poverty, social and economic disasters, war, terrorism. The horrors go on and on. There's so many things in the news, so many opportunities every single day for us to contemplate the suffering of the world and generate compassion. Jagda Tuku says, to give rise to compassion, we must put ourselves in the shoes of those touched by tragedy. If we only watch them from a distance, removed and isolated, we will become hardened to the misery around us. When we vividly picture the reality in intimate detail, the compassionate resolve to relieve their suffering naturally awakens. With this, the preponderance of news, the easy accessibility of news on the internet, the 24-hour news cycle, we have these stories at our fingertips, the stories of suffering, of so many beings' sufferings. We have them right there. But we do have a tendency to hold them at arm's length or think about them only in an intellectual way. We guard our hearts from really allowing these stories to touch us deeply. Recently, we passed the the marker of, we've had over 500,000 deaths from COVID-19 in this country. And that is a remarkable, kind of unimaginable number. And, you can see all of the news stations trying to figure out how to make people care. How do you make people care about a number that's that big? Because that size of a number is something that we intellectualize. It doesn't have a picture. It doesn't look like one family. It doesn't look like one suffering dog. It doesn't look like, one raccoon hit by a car on the side of the road. I feel like we see these instances, these vivid pictures of suffering, and we allow them to touch us, but then we hear a number like 500,000, and the depth of that suffering, the breadth of it, it's so expansive. All of the people, then 500,000 deaths, and then you think of all of the people who loved those 500,000 people, who loved and cared for them or relied on them, or, were parented by them or birthed them or were taught by them, or, whatever. But all of the ripple effect of that too, the numbers are unimaginable, the ripples of that suffering. And so we guard ourselves from that by intellectualizing it and holding it at bay. And so we might think we're absorbing the news all the time. We're reading the news. We're on the internet. We're on social media. We see things. We know what's up in the world. We know there was a military strike recently. There was, some economic disaster. There's this. There's some war. There's always war. There's, we kind of become jaded to it by intellectualizing it instead of opening our hearts to it. So, what our teachers are asking of us, though, is not to become like rote professors of the news and being able to rattle off numbers of how many people died in this tragedy or that tragedy, but to allow those tragedies to truly touch us, rip open our hearts. And, are we brave enough to do that? Are we brave enough to let the suffering of the world touch us deeply? We have to have courage to do that. We have to imagine the suffering of sentient beings and really put ourselves in their shoes. We can imagine, for instance, a desperate mother dying of starvation in a country that's been stricken by drought. And she's trying to care for her children as best as she can, but she's helpless to prevent them from dying a slow, painful death because there's no water. There's nothing she can do. Imagine that pain of watching your children die and not being able to help them. Imagine parents startled by a midnight phone call. Some stranger's voice is on the line telling them that they've lost their son or daughter. Imagine that. Or a frail elderly man who's been married to a woman for 50 years, maybe 60 years, and now she can't remember his name. Imagine the loneliness of that this is your partner who you've been with, who knows your whole history. They know all of your memories. They're the person who sees you clearest, and now they don't know who you are. And imagine the loneliness of that. Or a child whose playground is now a war zone filled with sudden, random, impersonal violence. And children who they still want to go out and play. And how does that affect you? Hearing the neighborhood rattled by bombs dropping, the shrapnel on the streets. Or you can imagine a woman who's just lost her best friend to the ravages of cancer or to COVID-19. It's not difficult to picture these lives. And these lives could so easily become our own. Where we have no idea. Any one of us could have one of those situations tomorrow. We don't know. We don't know. But we just don't do it. We don't go there. We hold ourselves back from imagining that. We can imagine the suffering of animals. Every creature values its life just as we value ours, but we're usually unwilling to acknowledge this. For instance, a fisherman doesn't know or really care that the fish wants to live, that the hook cuts and tears that fish's cheek and permanently disfigures it. Maybe it impacts them from their eating from then on. Even if they let that fish go, it could still die early because it's not able to eat, because its cheek's been torn open. Or think of lobsters. Boy, people put these living, breathing, squirming animals in a boiling pot of water, and the lobsters try to climb out of the pot. I had a coworker of mine told me a story in which her husband, and this was like a first date, it sounds like an awful first date, but her husband had gotten lobsters and was going to cook them. The lobsters escaped from the bag and they crawled onto the kitchen floor, and they were trying to fight them on the floor. They knew that there was death waiting for them, and they tried to fight the people coming after them with their claws. And they had this whole like a scene from a Western, this like standoff between the humans and the lobsters, trying to wrangle these lobsters and get them into this boiling pot of water. And these lobsters clearly wanted to live. They clearly were fighting for their lives. And yet, somehow, people eat lobsters, imagining that this animal does not value its life or does not experience pain in the same way that we do. If you're one of those people, I'll let you know there was a study in Switzerland that proved that they do experience pain. And now it's illegal to put live lobsters in pots in Switzerland. So we slowly catch up. We slowly catch up to the idea that other beings feel pain. But it has to be proven to us, though. That's what really disturbs me, is that we don't assume sentience. We don't assume that, like we err on the side of assuming an animal is an object and that it doesn't feel pain until we have proven by our own rationale that it does and that it's worthy of compassion. And the hubris of that is just the ego of that, of thinking that like, I'm going to come up with the criteria that would determine whether this being can be proven to deserve my compassion. Like, why are we so stingy? Why are we so stingy with our compassion? Why do we have to think in that way? Why can't we just say, like, I'm going to err on the side of everything might feel pain. I'm going to be gentle with it. I'm going to be compassionate. And if it's proven to me that this rock does not feel pain, great. Then, I can knock that one off my list. But I'm going to err on the side of caution and assume that I should be compassionate to everything. Why do we not err on that side? It's astounding me. We read, and there's been so many studies of animals, for instance, of just like, one by one, we learned that animals are smarter than we made them out to be, or they feel pain and we didn't think they did. We assume fish don't feel pain and they're stupid and they don't brains. They're more like, floating rocks or something. And now we find out fish can use tools. They have tool use. So we've been wrong. So I guess we've been wrong so many times. I wonder why we don't just switch our rationale and start wondering, why shouldn't I be compassionate? Why should this being have to prove itself to me to be deserving of my compassion? Even insects scurry away to avoid being crushed. If you ever try to catch a fly, as soon as a shadow passes over them, they fly away because they know to preserve their own life. I think of domesticated animals who endure lives of grueling labor, or being, like cows separated from their calves, and these mother cows will call out to their babies through the night. and they can sense the approaching slaughter, and they panic on their way to the slaughterhouse. And then in the wild, we have smaller animals who are eaten by larger ones, which are in turn devoured by parasites. All along the food chain, animals are subject to constant predation. They are constantly experiencing the fear of kill or be killed, basically. Even our pets suffer. We think our pets are very happy because we generally take good care of them, I certainly hope. But they still become sick and old. They might die in pain, and they're completely dependent on us. When we leave the house, they have no idea if we'll return or how long it will be till we return, or whether they'll be fed and cared for. Untitled Chapter Rinpoche tells a heartbreaking story about a dog that he had who was very dependent on him, really loved him, and he left for like a day. Like he left the dog in the care of someone else for like a day or two. It was not that long, and the dog became just like heartbroken over the loss of his master here, and the dog was so heartbroken that even when Chagda Tuku returned, the dog wasn't the same, and he cried through the night, and then ran away, and basically died of a broken heart. So it's, our animals they become codependent on us, really. I mean, it's like they're not necessarily, we may take good care of them, but it's not like they don't suffer. And the worst suffering of animals and humans is 1,000 times less severe than that of beings in the hell realms. If we become more aware of what it must be like to be a hell realm being, suffering from extreme cold or extreme heat, we will never become disillusioned with our human existence. No matter what kinds of terrible illnesses, chronic pain, whatever miserable family life we may have, or if we are in poverty, any of these obstacles will no longer seem so difficult once we really put them in the perspective of the suffering of those in the hell realms. So even thinking about the human realm, when we think about the suffering in the human realm, there's plenty of suffering there to put our own fortunate circumstances in perspective. We're not dying of malnutrition. We are not watching our children starve to death. We may have some business difficulties. We may have a roof that needs repair, but we're still alive. We can feel the warm sun shining through the window. We can hear the birds call, see the birds in the trees. We can look into our children's eyes and tell them that we love them. We're not on our deathbed. And even comparing North America with the rest of the world, even the poorest people in North America are better off than the impoverished in some other regions of the world. For instance, in parts of Asia, people go for years without a home or enough to eat. And that happens in America too. But most people in America, suffer from another type of stress, or another type of difficulty, which is stress and emotional balance, and we have an extremely high suicide rate. But we rarely appreciate the quality of our lives, the fortune that we have that others do not have. We rarely appreciate this, choosing instead to fixate on our problems. If we lose our job, or we lose a relationship, or maybe even some objects, certain objects that are meaningful to us, we obsess about it night and day. I mean, just think about getting a paper cut and how a paper cut can completely steal our attention. Jetsama says, "You must cultivate the memory that even in this visible world where beings can be seen, there is suffering that you cannot comprehend. You must think that there are children being abused everywhere, that there is starvation and poverty. You must think about the terrible diseases that afflict the body, speech, and mind. You must think about the horrible things that come along with suffering and the depth of suffering that exists, even in the realms that you can witness. If you think about that every day, more about that than you do about yourself, you will not fall off the path of Dharma. When you become weak, when you waver, that is when you think the path is all about you. It's when you forget that you are practicing for their sake, and that you are practicing also to liberate your mind so that you can be a benefit to others. Often we don't want to contemplate the suffering of others because we think it will be too painful. We don't want to bring their suffering into our experience because we fear unhappiness. We're so concerned with preserving our own happiness, even if it means relying completely on delusion, on just like, close your eyes, close your ears, la 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 la. I'm gonna pretend like there's no suffering in the world. And we're too afraid of unhappiness to contemplate the suffering of others. But and this is not intuitive, but compassion actually reduces our own suffering by putting our experience into perspective and releasing us from the tight grip of our focus on self. We don't realize how much focusing on ourself causes us misery. But compassion releases us from that tight grip on our self-focus. And then we can begin thinking about how to alleviate the suffering of others. And you don't have to take my word for it, because now even science can verify the benefits of meditating on compassion in this way. For instance, brain imaging using functional MRIs while lamas meditate on boundless compassion reveals that their brains show remarkable levels of activation in two key areas: the site that generates happiness and bliss, and the part of the brain the site that generates readiness to take action. And the 8 lamas that were involved in this particular study had put in from 10,000 to 60,000 hours of practice time. And the longer that they had done so, the stronger their brain's activity level. But even ordinary volunteers who practiced this meditation for only a month had 10% increases in those brain regions. That's only after a month they saw improvement. But the lamas who had been meditating for years and years had, on average, 10 times more activity. And for some lamas, the jump was as much as 80 times greater. So these, meditations on compassion are incredibly potent. They have a measurable effect on our brains. And while the lamas studied in modern labs have done at least 6 years of intensive retreat, it's been routine for the great masters of Tibet to have done 3 or even 4 times that amount. For example, Tuku Organ Rinpoche and Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche each spent more than 20 years in intensive retreat. And some of the masters who lived their entire life in Tibet did even more. For instance, Tuku Organ's father put in 33 years of meditation retreat over the course of his life. And the effects of meditating on compassion go far beyond what science can measure, though. There's a classic story that illustrates this. The story about a yogi, a very good meditator who went into retreat. In some Buddhist retreats, the practitioner will meditate and pray day and night for at least 3 years, and they sleep very little during this time. And usually, after some time, a sign will appear. They'll have a vision or a dream that lets them know that they're on the right track. So this particular yogi had been praying to Maitreya Buddha constantly. But after 6 years, he still had not had a single dream or received a single sign. And so he started to become discouraged. and he left the retreat. As he walked down the road, he came across a man standing by a huge iron pillar. And the man was doing something very peculiar. He had a silk scarf, and he was polishing the pillar with this silk scarf. And the yogi asked him what he's doing. And the man said, "I'm making a needle." So the yogi thought, wow, what diligence this man has. Here I am, discouraged after 6 years of meditating, and he's trying to make a needle out of an iron pillar. He's trying to make a needle out of an iron pillar using nothing but a silk scarf. So this meditator scolded himself all the way back to his cave, where he sat down and meditated for another 3 years. But after that, he had another wave of doubt because he still hadn't had any of these auspicious dreams or visions. So he left retreat again, and he came upon another strange sight. There was a man standing in front of a tall cliff, and he was dipping a feather into a bucket of water and brushing it across the surface of the stone. The yogi asked, "What are you doing?" And the man said, "I'm removing this cliff. It casts a shadow on my house, and I'd like to remove it so I can feel the warmth of the sun." And the yogi thought, wow, this man has so much diligence in the face of such an impossible task. So he again went back to his cave, scolding himself all the way for being lazy. And he sat down and meditated, and this time he was even more diligent for another 3 years. And at this point, he had spent a total of 12 years in meditation without having received the slightest indication that anything positive had happened. He was totally dejected at this point, and so he left retreat once and for all. He just gave up. But he hadn't gone very far when he came upon a wounded dog. And this dog's hindquarters were covered with maggots. When the yogi extended his hand to help her, she viciously snapped at him. And when this happened, deep compassion arose in his heart, and he decided to try and help this poor dog. The dog was filthy. Her wounds were gangrenous and oozing, and the yogi and filled with maggots. So the yogi thought, well, if I clean her wounds, the maggots will die. And I can't kill one being to save the life of another. I have to somehow remove the maggots without killing them. He decided the only thing to do was to lick the maggots one by one from the dog's wounds and gently set them aside. So it took him a moment. He had to gather his resolve to do this. He gathered his resolve, closed his eyes, and he bent down to lick the dog's wounds. But instead, his tongue touched the ground. He opened his eyes, and in front of him stood Maitreya Buddha. "Where have you been?" he exclaimed. He said, "I prayed to you for 12 years. You have no compassion. You never responded." And Maitreya Buddha replied, "What are you talking about? I've been with you from the very first day of your retreat, but your obscurations and mental poisons prevented you from seeing me." He said, "I was the man at the pillar, but you couldn't perceive me. I was the man at the cliff, but you didn't recognize me. Finally, your compassion for the dog purified the karma that obscured your vision. If you don't believe this, carry me around town on your back and see if anyone else can perceive me." So the yogi lifted Maitreya Buddha onto his back, and he walked through the village, asking people what they saw. Everyone except for one old woman responded the same way. They said, "What are you talking about? There's nothing on your back. Are you crazy?" But the old woman had fewer karmic obscurations than the others, and so she saw a wounded dog being carried on his shoulders. For this yogi, one moment of pure-hearted compassion had far more impact than 12 years of meditation. Many people lose sight of the selfless purpose of spiritual practice, especially in the West, I think. It's where it gets mingled up with wellness and self-care and all these other things. A way to be 10% happier. But spiritual practice is not a matter of sitting in self-absorbed prayer and meditation in some remote cave or retreat cabin. The power and the essence of spiritual practice lies in compassion and the cultivation of a good heart. When we offer a prayer with the burning aspiration that the suffering of others should cease, that is significantly more effective than a prayer made to overcome one's own suffering. Praying on behalf of someone who is suffering, thinking of them as a representative of all suffering beings, is an extremely potent, compassionate act. When we understand that the root of suffering is negative karma, and that the root of that karma is hatred, greed, and ignorance, we will understand that the only cure for suffering is the eradication of hatred, greed, and ignorance from the mind streams of sentient beings. And the root of hatred, greed, and ignorance is desire. So are we thinking about suffering sentient beings just to bum ourselves out? Are we opening our heart? But ultimately, it's like, I feel like a lot of times people say, well, I don't want to think about all that suffering because what am I going to do about it? Like, I can't do anything about it. So what's the point of thinking about it? But there is something you can do. There's something very potent that you can do. Jetsama says, you can practice Dharma in such a way that you yourself become free of hatred, greed, and ignorance. You can practice so that you can liberate your mind from cyclic existence for one reason and one reason only. That after liberating your mind, you can emanate in a form that will continue to benefit beings. You can liberate your mind from desire to such a degree that you have only one hope. And that hope is that you will be born again and again in a form that will bring this antidote to other suffering beings. That's what you can do. And the good news is you can start right now. Chagda Tuku says, we don't have to wait for a special time or place to awaken compassion. We can practice it anywhere, as we walk, talk, or drive our car. When we begin to see everyone as former parents who, while seeking happiness, are only planting seeds of suffering, we will increasingly regard all those we encounter with greater compassion, love, and respect. So I'd like to end our class today with a contemplation on the suffering of sentient beings. And between each round of contemplation, between each contemplation, we will allow the mind to rest. Allowing the mind to rest is an effortless process that Chagda Tuku says reveals an indwelling awareness, an awareness that is non-dual, not a subjective awareness of an act. Usually when people meditate, they try to do something. For instance, even in the meditation we did at the beginning of the class, we were doing something. We were focusing our minds on our breath. We had a specific action that we were doing. But when we're, in this case, instead of trying to do something, when we rest the mind, we're going to just let the mind relax. You don't block it, don't follow it, just let it be. We are allowing our mind to rest in the spontaneously open space in which thoughts arise and subside. So we'll alternate contemplation with these periods of rest. And doing that is extremely helpful for integrating these contemplations and of integrating them deeper into our being. So let's come back to your meditation posture. And sit up straight in a relaxed position. Put your hands in your lap in a relaxed way. And I'm just going to get my timer ready. Okay. Allow your mind to just settle for a second. Think of all of those around you. Think of all of those around the world who are dying in hospitals right now. I want you to allow yourself to expand this to all of the hospitals around the world. Think of all of the hospitals in your state where people are dying. Are the hospitals where you are they overloaded with COVID-19 patients? Are they full right now? Think of the hospitals across the nation. Think of how many hospitals there are. How many beings are in those hospitals? Think of the hospitals across this entire continent. Think of the hospitals in both North America and South America. The hospitals in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, Australia. Do they have a hospital in Antarctica? I don't know. I imagine they do at their research station. Think of all of the many beings in all of these hospitals across the world. Think of everyone who is dying right now. A dying grandmother in Croatia, a dying child in Sudan, a family who has been perhaps injured by a bomb explosion, and they are all in a hospital with their individual sufferings, but dying. Of all of these different circumstances, the different ways that people may be dying. They may be dying of cancer or COVID or old age or an autoimmune disorder or from violence, from stabbing, from a gunshot. So many different permutations of suffering that are out there. Think of all of these beings dying in hospitals right now. We're going to think about this for just a minute. Allow yourself to be very vivid in your imagining of this. Imagine what their experience is like. Imagine the fear that comes with pain. The fear that comes from the lack of control of being in a hospital and relying on others. Now imagine that you yourself are on your deathbed. You're about to lose all that you have gathered through a lifetime of effort. You can't take any of it with you. Your friends and family surround you. They hold your hand. You love them so much. But no matter how much you love them, no matter how much you're attached to them, in a few moments, you will never see them again. Think of all their loving faces. Imagine yourself in vivid detail stretched out on the hospital bed. All of their loving faces around you. How grateful you are for their presence. How much you want to stay with them. And in just a few moments, you will never see them again. Imagine your terror. Then let your mind rest. Now bring your attention back to your present circumstances. You're not dying in this moment. You're not losing those you love. You're not starving. You're not about to be killed. You are safe and comfortable. Appreciate your good fortune. Ground yourself in the good fortune of this present moment. And let your mind rest. Now resolve to do whatever you can to reduce the suffering of others. Form a deep commitment to do anything you possibly can to reduce the suffering of others. And then let the mind rest. Now formulate a prayer that you will accomplish this. So make a prayer that you will be able to reduce the suffering of others and to be able to use this life well in that way. You can pray to whoever your object of refuge is, whether you're a Buddhist or anything else. Just formulate a prayer. And let the mind rest. So that template, a contemplation of doing the contemplating the suffering of others and allowing the mind to rest and alternating these contemplations with periods of rest. You can do that contemplation on your own anytime you want. You don't have to just think about people dying. You can repeat this process, imagining all sorts of different circumstances in which others are suffering. You might consider beings living in war zones, or the suffering of animals in slaughterhouses, or any number of sufferings. And by practicing in this way, you can create a deep resolve to use this life for the benefit of others and to generate intense compassion, such intense compassion that it never stops bursting forth, it becomes a well that never runs dry. So I wish that for you. I hope that you will continue to practice in this way and that you will develop a compassion as great as any of the Buddhas. The only difference between Buddhas and sentient beings is perseverance. So please persevere. I learned a word today, perdure. So it's like endure, like to endure something. You can endure something for a certain period of time, but to perpetually endure is perdure. So I hope you will perdure in your practice. And at the end of your practice, always remember to dedicate the merit for the benefit of all beings. And we will do that now. By this effort, may all sentient beings be free of suffering. May their minds be filled with the nectar of virtue. In this way, may all causes resulting in suffering be extinguished, and only the light of compassion shine throughout all realms.